All right, thanks. I want to welcome everybody in and direct you to a poll that is on the screen right now and ask you all to participate in that. Give us feedback so we can better understand what you're looking for from the Penn State Alumni Association and our virtual programs that we offer. We will get started in just a minute. Again, if you're just joining us, we have a poll. We invite you to participate in that. Give us some feedback on how we can improve our virtual experiences that we are offering through the Penn State Alumni Association. It is great to see so many people joining us. We will get started in just 1 minute. Well, I want to welcome everybody. Good afternoon, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session. As many of us are transitioning to living, working, and learning remotely, the Alumni Association is ensuring you stay connected to one another in the university and also stay informed. And as a reminder, today's discussion is being recorded. Today, we welcome Dr. Christina Grozinger. Today's discussion is the latest installment of a recurring series of virtual programming that the Alumni Association is bringing to the Penn State community. We'll be speaking with experts, university leaders, and other Penn Staters who will share insight and perspective with you in the coming weeks and months. Additionally, the Alumni Associations offers a host of online networking events, career programs, and webinars. And you can find the full listing of our events at alumni.psu.edu/events. Now I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Christina Grozinger. She is a distinguished professor of entomology and the director of the Center for Pollinator Research at Penn State. She is also a fellow of the Entomological Society of America and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Pennsylvania's uniquely diverse cropping system depends on both managed and wild pollinators. Dr. Grozinger will discuss the importance of pollinators to our agricultural and natural systems, the surprising diversity of pollinators in Pennsylvania, current threats to pollinator populations, and what we can do to preserve and expand our pollinators for future generations. She will also highlight the research, education, extension, and outreach programs of Penn State Center for Pollinator Research and how these can help you support pollinators in your own backyards. And so I am delighted to turn the program over to Dr. Christina Grozinger. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today and sort of have joined us over your lunch hour. So let me pull up my screen. So I have a lot of things that I would like to talk to you about today, and I'd also really like to hear your questions at the end. There's two things that I wanted to highlight that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail out, but there's more information if you want it from our website. And so this is, first, there's been a lot of interest in the Asian giant hornets, which have been also called the murder hornets, and we're getting a lot of questions about these. They were identified. There's some specimens that have been found in Vancouver and Washington State. And there is a great fact sheet that was written by one of the faculty members in our department, Michael Scavarla. And if you look on our website, it's sort of the first news story. And I think it's also going to be sent out as a link after this session, so you can get more information from that. The other thing is that I'm going to be focusing mostly about our research and education related to bees as pollinators and our efforts to support and expand these bee populations. But bees actually have a lot of really interesting social behaviors and natural histories and evolutionary histories as well that I won't have a chance to talk about, but we do a lot of really great work on that in our center also. And so I just wanted to highlight the work of Etche Anslem and Heather Hines, who are two faculty members in our center, and they do work related to these questions. Etche just received a National Science Foundation career grant earlier this year, which is a very big honor, and Heather received one when she was an assistant professor a few years ago. So if you want to learn more about these areas, I encourage you to check out their websites. So I usually like to start pretty basic when we were talking about bees and pollination, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the important key question is, what is pollination? It's basically movement of the daddy parts of the flower to the mommy parts of the flower, so the movement of the pollen to different flowers. And this is mediated in about 90% of flowering plant species. Animals, such as insects, will help with this pollination process. And so then that leads to the question of, why do animals actually pollinate? And it's because they're getting food resources from the plants. So flowers will produce nectar, which is a sugary substance, which a lot of animals use for their carbohydrates. And so as they're collecting the nectar, they might incidentally pick up the pollen and move that around. But also the pollen itself can be an important nutrition source. and it provides a lot of proteins and fats. And so bees in particular have evolved to collect pollen and bring it back to their nests and feed to their babies. And so they have a lot of behavioral and morphological adaptations that help them move pollen around. So for example, with this honeybee, she's very hairy. She has specialized pollen baskets. And because they're moving all of this pollen around, that makes them really important and good pollinators. And so since so many flowering plant species do benefit from animal-mediated pollination, that means that a lot of our agricultural crops are also pollinated. And so I like to sort of show this slide and have people sort of think to themselves, if I took away everything that benefited from pollination services of insects, you'd be left with. And basically, you would be left with this, which is not very much. So as hopefully most of you know, a lot of our vegetables and fruits and tree nuts are pollinated, but also some foods that you might not really think about as pollinated, such as broccoli and carrots. We need to have pollination in order to set seed. Cotton is pollinated. Some of our timber crops, such as black cherry, are pollinated, and cattle, dairy cattle specifically, will eat a lot of alfalfa, which requires pollination to set seed. And so again, it's about 3/4 of our major food crops that benefit from pollination services. It's also important to remember that we need to have different kinds of pollinators to support these different crops. So for example, squash bees are specialists on a lot of our cucurbit crops. So these are our melons and our pumpkins. Flies are the second most important agricultural pollinators after bees, and they pollinate things like carrots. Again, our fruits are being pollinated by various bee species, including honeybees and orchard bees. And my favorite is agave, which is important for tequila, which is pollinated by bats. So when you guys are enjoying your quarantinis over your happy hours by Zoom, please be sure to thank your bats for that. All right, so what is going on with our pollinators? So in Pennsylvania, beekeepers report that 40 to 50% of their colonies die every winter, which is a really significant number when you think about sort of the economic toll of that and also the emotional toll to these beekeepers. For wild bees, we don't have numbers that are as clear because they're not being tracked by dedicated beekeepers, but there has been work done for a couple of species. So bumblebees in particular have been pretty well studied. And we know that about half of the studied bumblebee species in the United States are showing declines. And there's one local species, a rusty patch bumblebee, that has been listed as endangered. I like to show this example of Bombus pennsylvanicus. So in gray is its historical distribution. In yellow are the areas where the researchers were sampling the bumblebees. And in orange is where they actually found specimens of Bombus pennsylvanicus. And so you can see that this used to be a very widespread species, but now it was really only being found in the Midwest. So it's exhibiting a significant range control. Also, monarch butterflies are another very charismatic pollinator species that has been monitored for a long time, and they're showing declines of about 80% over the last 20 years. So these declines are sort of symptomatic of larger declines that have been found across insect species and insect communities, both in agricultural areas and in also areas that should be fairly untouched in terms of human activities. And I always like to point out that these declines, you know, they seem to be increasing over the last 20 years that we've been monitoring, but they're also happening. In the 1930s and 1940s, Edith Patch, who is the first female president of the Entomological Society, she's also related to one of our faculty members, Professor Harlan Patch. She highlighted these concerns about insect declines and what impacts that might have on our ecological systems. And of course, Rachel Carson with Silent Spring similarly raised awareness of these larger biodiversity declines. And so these are obviously problematic and they're very challenging and difficult to deal with, but they can also provide opportunities for us to think about how we might want to interact with our environment and our agricultural and urban systems in different ways. And so after Silent Spring was published, that led to the Environmental Protection Agency and the adoption of integrated pest management approaches. So what are the main factors responsible for these bee declines and these declines in insect biodiversity in general? So there's multiple factors that all interact with each other synergistically, include climate change, loss of habitat, which for bees means loss of nesting habitat for wild bees, and also loss of flowering plants that they're depending on for their food, increased pesticide use. And just as a side note here, Maggie Douglas, when she was a postdoc at Penn State, and then now as an assistant professor at Dickinson College, she mapped out the pesticide use patterns across agricultural systems in the United States and created an aggregated insect toxicity score. And based on that, we can see that there's been a significant increase in the total toxic load in agricultural landscapes across the US over the last 20 years. And so over the entire US, it's about a 9-fold increase in toxicity. And in some regions, this is actually up to about a 120-fold increase. So this, of course, one would expect would have negative impacts on the insects living in these areas. Also, pathogens and parasites are important contributors to population declines. I'm not going to talk about this so much today, and I'm going to focus mostly on our sort of landscape efforts because these are areas where I think you can help us. But I wanted to point out that, again, we are doing research in this area within our center, which I can tell you about at some other point. And Allison Ray, who's a graduate student in our group, just published a paper where she mapped out the distribution of newly identified bee viruses across the United States to try to find evidence of which of these might represent an emerging disease. Okay, so Pennsylvania is actually in a really good position with respect to pollinators because we have a very diverse agricultural cropping system. So we have about 7 to 12 crops per county. Most states in the US only have about 4 crops, and these typically are crops that are don't use pollinators. So again, we have a diverse cropping system. We have fairly small fields, and that means that we have bee habitat within a few hundred meters that can support wild bee nesting and then also foraging. And when we look in our agricultural crops, we find a lot of bees. So David Bittinger has been studying tree fruit orchards in Pennsylvania over many years, and he's found about 235 different bee species that are present in these orchards, and over 50 of these are actually visiting the apple and cherry blossoms and potentially contributing to pollination of those crops. Shelby Fleischer did a similar study with a former graduate student, Carly McGrady, and in pumpkin fields, and they found 37 different wild bee species that were visiting pumpkins. And when they calculated the pollination activity of those bees, they were providing 15 times the pollination necessary to actually set fruit. So again, our wild bees in Pennsylvania are diverse and abundant and actually providing a lot of pollination services for us. So given that we are in sort of a good place for pollinators, and yet there are all these threats to pollinators that we're aware of, what are we doing at Penn State to address these? And then what can you do, and how can you take the information that we're developing and use that in your own backyards or your municipalities or your farms? So the first thing is, how do you sort of save things if you don't know what they are, right? So Shelby Kilpatrick and Margarita Lopez Uribe recently published an updated checklist for bees in Pennsylvania, and they use state records and new collections to identify all the bees species that we have present here. And we have 437 bee species. And just to put that into context, in the United Kingdom, there's about 270 bee species. So again, we have a really diverse system that we can work with. This also sort of leads to questions of how do you track the distributions and the populations of all of these different bee species, because obviously this is a major task. And so to try to develop a more streamlined system for that, we've been collaborating with folks in engineering to develop an automated live insect monitoring system. And so this would be leveraging computer vision and machine learning technologies so that we can identify maybe not species, but perhaps genus or families of these insects sort of in real time. And this is in collaboration with Professor Vijay Narayanan, who spoke in this series last week. And there's a dedicated team of graduate students who, like many of our graduate students at Penn State, have set up sort of labs in their homes and in their backyards to be able to do this work despite the quarantine. Another area of research that we've been focusing on is trying to identify the plant species that would most benefit pollinators. So obviously there's a lot of different plants that can be included in your gardens or in your businesses or on farms. And so trying to figure out which ones we should specifically be trying to plant to support pollinator populations is a big question. And so this was a question from Varroa when he was a graduate student at Penn State. And he was interested specifically in understanding what kinds of pollen resources bees were collecting and how that benefited their nutritional needs. And so this is this cute little sort of nutritional guideline for pollen that Anthony created. So you can see that bees get a lot of different things from pollen, but importantly, they get their 2 macronutrients of proteins and fats pretty much exclusively from pollen. And so Anthony's hypothesis was that when bees were in the field, they were trying to get an optimal ratio of proteins to lipids that would best support their individual and their colony health. And he did these studies with bumblebees, and using both semi-field studies and also lab studies, he demonstrated bees were preferentially foraging on plants that had pollen with a 4:1 protein lipid ratio. And so it wasn't the color of the plants or the sense of the plants, but actually the nutritional quality that they were honing in on. So very recently, Anthony, together with a very large group of collaborators, published data on the protein lipid ratios of 82 different plant species, and this is summarized here. And again, the link to this article will be provided later on after this session, and you can also find it on our website in the news area. And so you can see that these different plant families have really different wide spread of protein lipid ratios, and the bee species that we've been sampling seem to be falling across this range. And so that would suggest that potentially we can improve nutrition for these different bee species by trying to plant specifically plant species that have protein lipid ratios that match their needs. Another interesting question is that there is a huge ornamental plant industry, and these plants are being developed and bred for their color and their shape and their habits, and not necessarily their nutritional value to bees. But obviously, if we can make these urban gardens that use these plants more nutritious for bees, that would be a benefit to the ecosystems as well. So graduate student Emily Erickson has been studying the attractiveness of and the nutritional quality of annual and perennial ornamental plant species, and published here. And you can see that there's a lot of variation among the different cultivars that she studied. And because the ornamental plant industry changes so rapidly, and there's always new cultivars that are coming to market, Emily has been working on developing sort of a rapid assessment protocol and associated decision support tool that growers can use to more effectively score and rank their plants for their attractiveness for bees. And then finally, we just had a study that was published from work that was led by Dr. Doug Sponsler in collaboration with Don Schump, who's a beekeeper in Philadelphia. And this was looking to see if we could identify which plants in urban areas were best or most supported bee populations. And so for this study, Doug put these automated scales underneath colonies that were in rooftop apiaries around Pennsylvania, so he could track the colony weight gain and weight loss to identify periods of nectar flow and nectar dearth. And then he also collected the pollen that was coming into these colonies and used DNA barcoding to identify the plant species that the bees were foraging on. And so overall, what he found was that in the springtime, bees were foraging on flowering trees. And so these are things like oak and maple and willow. And then in the summer, they switched to more perennial herbaceous plant species. And in the fall, they were foraging on woody vines and shrubs. And again, this paper will be available to you. It's open access. You can read more about this. So the hope would be if we can include some of these planting schemes into our urban areas, we can again improve the nutritional availability for honeybees and other wild bees. We also created habitat assessment guide that you can look at and sort of work through to try to look in your own backyards to try to see if you have good habitat for bees or if there's any improvements that you could potentially make. But bees forage over really long distances, right? So this is one example of our complex landscape in Pennsylvania, and solitary bees, so most of our wild bees, can cover most of this range, and honeybees will fly actually much further than this distance. So how can you identify or understand the landscape conditions for your bees in such broad areas? So to try to address this, we've been developing these indices of landscape quality. And our collaborator, Eric Lonsdorf at University of Minnesota, developed a couple of years ago now a nesting resource index and a floral resource index that basically takes land use patterns and converts it into scores of resource quality. And then Maggie Douglas, as she was doing her study that I talked about earlier, also downscaled this index so that we can get information at a 30-meter resolution scale that can tell you about the aggregate toxic load that is predicted to be in the landscape in our agricultural areas. And to make these indices available to you, we've created an online decision support tool, which is called Beescape. It currently works for Wisconsin to New York, and including, of course, Pennsylvania, but we're hoping in the next 2 weeks or so, this should be available for the entire United States. And just to show you, and this was done in collaboration with a large number of researchers and across a number of universities and also the USDA. And we partnered with Xavia, which is a Philadelphia-based company, to develop this portal. And so just to kind of show you how this works, so you can go into Beescape, find your site, either your backyard or your apiary, and you can drop a pin, and then you get information about the index scores for nesting, insecticide, and then spring, summer, and fall floral quality. And if you're in the website and you sort of hover over these, you'll get information about whether these are medium, high, or low relative to the other landscapes in your area. If you go into a more agricultural region and then do a comparison, you can see that in the agricultural area, we're predicting lower nesting, higher insecticide loads, and then lower floral resources. So this can help you basically kind of explore your landscape, but we'd also like to be able to predict what's going on with bee populations in these areas. And so we've been doing a number of studies where we're looking at wild bee abundance and diversity, and also their pathogen loads, which I'm not going to talk about today. But we're also looking at honeybee health metrics. And so the first one that we looked at in detail was winter survival. And this was a study that was led by Martina Kalovi and Sarah Gossley from the USDA ARS. And this was using data coming from the Pennsylvania State Beekeepers Association over the last 3 years. In terms of their winter survival at their specific locations. And when we did our models for this, it turned out that it was not actually the landscape indices that were most predictive, but rather what was most predictive was whether or not the beekeepers controlled Varroa mite populations. So controlling Varroa mites led to much higher survival. And also the weather conditions seemed to be really important. And so if you had a growing season, in the previous growing season that was either too hot or too cold, the bees did not survive as well. So to be able to share this information with beekeepers, we developed another online tool, which is called our Bee Winterwise tool. And basically this works the same way as Beescape in the sense that you can navigate to your location, drop a pin, and then you'll pull up information over the last couple of years of what the overall scores were for your area. And then you can also watch in the current year as the growing degree days accumulate for and then you can see if these scores are falling within sort of an optimal or a too hot or too cool range. And so for this particular example, this seems to be always a little bit too cool for what we think will be optimal for the bees. At this point, this tool is only working in Pennsylvania, but through Beescape, people can enter information about their winter bee survival and their GIS locations. And so as we get more information, we can expand this out into other areas. So if you want to learn more information, we have a lot of different resources that you can go to. So our Center for Pollinator Research website has on it the Pennsylvania Pollinator Protection Plan, which gives a lot of details about best practices for beekeeping, pesticide use, and forage and habitat in urban, suburban, agricultural and natural areas, and also roadsides and rights of way. The Penn State Master Gardeners have developed a very successful pollinator garden certification program, which is basically a step-by-step guide to how to develop a pollinator garden. And then once you've developed it, you can get it certified and then have a sign so you can encourage your neighbors to do the same. We have an online Beekeeping 101 course, which is for beginning beekeepers. We have a lot of information that's part of our Bee Extension website, and there will be a pollinator webinar series that starts in about 2 weeks, and that will focus on honeybees, bumblebees, orchard bees, and other sort of areas related to pollinator health. We have the Pollinators Garden at the Arboretum at Penn State, which is under construction now and should be done by the end of next year. And this will be a 4-acre garden. It's the largest in the world, and it will incorporate much of the research that we've been doing on how to develop forage and habitat for pollinators. At the Orchard Road site, there is a solar site that has been put in place, and we're putting pollinator plantings and a pollinator meadow under that site, and that will also be, I think, helpful for individuals interested in developing these pollinator meadows in their own yards and areas. And then finally, the Frost Entomological Museum has a really great bee exhibit along with many other exhibits, and so once we're allowed to see each other again, I encourage you to come and visit the Frost. And with that, I think I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great, Dr. Grozinger, that was fascinating. So a lot of questions are rolling in here, and let's get to some of those. But first, just an observation from me that this presentation is the most Penn State thing that I've seen all day. And I'm sure it's probably funny to hear me say that, but as you went through the presentation, it was all about the team that's around you and about the research of others and how you're sharing information. And if that's not kind of quintessential what Penn State's all about, it's about the team and how we work together, and that there's no one individual, but just immediately, that's the first thing that jumped out to me. Talk a little bit about the community that you work with, and how the sharing of information has helped the research.
Yeah, so I think that is a great point, Paul. And I think this is one of the most gratifying things about being at Penn State is that people are so excited to collaborate and to share their expertise across fields. And so it has been very easy for us to set up collaborations across other colleges. So I highlighted, for example, our collaborators within the College of Engineering, but we also have a really great group of collaborators in the College of Education, where we're working with them to develop tools for learning in informal environments, so like the Arboretum, for example, and Shavers Creek, for those of you who go there. We're developing sort of a little pollinator app for that. And then we're also working with the Center for Science in the Schools on developing K-12 programming that can be included into curricula for those classrooms. But it's really, yeah, I mean, it just makes it such a fun and dynamic place to work, in that everyone is just very excited to see how we can work together, and not only sort of move our research in our fields forward, but also develop information that can be used by others, right? So I think a big part of what we're trying to do is make sure that the work that we're doing can inspire and inform not just beekeepers and growers, but also citizen scientists and members of the public.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to dive into that in just a little bit. And I know a lot of technical questions are coming in, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. But I want to hear a little bit about your backstory. How did you become interested in this research area? How did you come to Penn State? And just to kind of share a little bit about your story.
Sure. So actually my background and my sort of training was not in entomology. I got my PhD actually in chemistry. And my focus of my work was actually more on sort of molecular and cellular biology. But I was trying to think about sort of what I wanted to do in the future, and I wanted a research area that would be really broad and would take, decades to really be able to answer, so that there would always be some interesting question to work on. And actually, my brother, Stefan Grozinger, he's a lawyer in Connecticut, he had started keeping bees, and he would tell me these cool stories about their behaviors that I just thought was really fascinating. And the work that I was doing, again, on the sort of molecular end of things, seemed like it could be applied to understanding bee social behavior and the genetics that regulated that. And so I actually switched fields after my PhD and did a postdoctoral fellowship at University of Illinois with Gene Robinson, where I started studying the genomics of chemical communication systems in bees. And that was sort of the primary focus of my research group for the first couple of years. And so I became an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. And then I was recruited to Penn State as an associate professor. And kind of during that time was when colony collapse disorder sort of hit the news. And this was in late 2006 to 2007, that winter. And that was also the time that the honeybee genome was sequenced, which then sort of provide more opportunity to sort of study these things at a molecular level. And it was also when the National Academy of Sciences released the status of pollinators in North America. So those sort of three things together really catalyzed a lot of interest in pollinator health and sort of managing bee health very broadly. And so kind of over the years, we've, my lab and others have sort of looking at that in more detail. And so from that, at the point that I came to Penn State, we actually had a lot of faculty who were already doing research in this area. And we realized that it sort of made sense for us to form the Center for Pollinator Research so that we could better share information with each other and also share that with the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's almost like a perfect storm of occurrences that happened right upon your arrival here at Penn State. And so we are very lucky to have you and very lucky to have that center here at Penn State. But you talked about the other states that you have lived in, whether it was Illinois or North Carolina. Are there aspects of Pennsylvania's ecosystem that make the landscape here conducive to pollinators?
Yeah, so this was sort of partly what I was touching on earlier. What makes Pennsylvania really interesting is that we have a very diverse landscape, right? So our agricultural systems are really diverse in terms of the number of crops and sort of our small diversified farming system. But also we have a lot of natural landscapes and a lot of forest and mountains. And then we also have very heavily urban areas. And so this, I think, makes Pennsylvania just a really great place to work on pollinators because we have so many different aspects of pollinator health and biology and conservation that we can think about. And each of these, has a very different ecological community and a different set of challenges and needs, right? So if we're thinking about pollinators in Philadelphia versus pollinators in the Allegheny National Forest, it's a totally different systems, which makes it, again, I think, just really fun to work with.
Absolutely. You talked about the decline in some populations, and I'm sure that there's many factors that have an impact on the pollinator population. But one question that's come in here is that they've recently read a study linking to the decline of bee populations to the rise of cellular technology. Is there any evidence that you have seen of this in your research?
No, so there's been a couple of studies that have investigated this, and that does not seem like that is a factor in these declines. The primary factors that are associated with these declines are really changes in land use practices and habitat, right? So this is, the loss of flowers, like both in terms of the abundance of flowers and also the diversity of those flowers, because just like us, bees need to be able to sample from sort of a diverse buffet in order to be healthy. And if you think also about sort of their overall life histories, bees are active throughout the entire growing season. And so, they need as soon as it gets warm enough and they're emerging, they need flowers that they can collect food from. And so I would really encourage folks to use our little habitat assessment guide and start wandering around your backyards and looking to see what kinds of flowering plants you actually have available and whether or not you actually see bees on them. And I think that will probably be fairly eye-opening for many people to realize that you have a beautiful lawn, but you don't really have enough flowers for bees. So really, it's more of these landscape factors as opposed to cell phones.
Yeah, I can go in a couple different directions here based on that answer, but let's focus on land use and how land use has had an impact. There are some things that really hurt populations, but you and your team seem to have been really creative around around taking advantage of how different land use strategies could actually benefit the work that you're doing. You mentioned the work on Orchard Road and how you're using the solar farm over there. Talk a little bit more about that project.
Yeah, well, and I think in general, it's important to think about, just creatively as you kind of look around your environment. It's not that hard to find flowering plants that can fit into whatever sort of scheme that you're developing, as long as you kind of, there's awareness raised of that. So for example, again, in urban areas, there are a lot of plantings that are not necessarily supportive of pollinators, but they could be easily replaced with plantings that are. When you think about your street trees, right, if you just swap out some of those street trees with things that pollinators can actually use for food, that would create a huge bonanza of food for them, especially in the springtime. For these solar farms, again, there's a lot of space in solar farms, right? And so if that space can be covered with flowering plants that can support bees and other pollinators, and then more biodiversity in general, that again can become a very important ecological sort of community and system. And so in addition to the solar site on Orchard Road, there's also the large solar farms that Penn State is developing that I forget how many acres, there's hundreds of acres that will be included in that. And that will also include habitat and plantings for pollinators. And in terms of growers, there's again sort of a lot of different models that people can use for incorporating pollinator planting. So there's been a lot of interest in sort of like pollinator strips where you have sort of, a high density of pollinator plants kind of along the edge of fields. But Shelby Fleischer, for example, has been doing research on cover crops. So if you're putting cover crops in for weed suppression, if those can be flowering, then they can again support plant species. And there's been a big push by PennDOT to also incorporate pollinator habitat along roadsides and rights of way. So again, I think it's just a matter of sort of being aware of your environment and then making choices that can sort of help the ecology of your systems. And they can also be very functional and beautiful as well.
Excellent. Okay, so a couple questions coming in here looking for you to direct them towards resources. And so is there a list of flowers that we can plant in our yards and gardens that, well, another question came in and moved it. Is there a list of flowers that we can, for our plants and yards and gardens that have good nutrition for bee and pollinators? Where would somebody go to find those resources?
So I think probably the easiest source for you right now is to go to the Penn State Master Gardeners Pollinator Garden Certification Program, because that really is sort of a step-by-step guide that you can go through and select plants that are known to be attractive to pollinators. If you're on our website, we have a lot of different kinds of resources that you can look through. So the Pennsylvania Pollinator Protection Plan has a chapter on forage and habitat that links to various other resources that you can look at. So for example, the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign and the Pollinator Partnership developed these eco-regional guides that you can also use for pulling out plants that are appropriate in our area for pollinators, and then also can tell you if they're blooming in the spring through the fall. But again, I think if you sort of want like a quick start guide, the Master Gardener's certification program is the easiest way to go, and you can kind of start with that, and then as you sort of build up your garden and your sort of knowledge of these systems, then you
Right.
should start playing more with it.
Great. Another resource people are looking for, and I'm not familiar with the resource that they are referencing, so I apologize, but they're wondering if there is an EB similar to like an eBird. I'm assuming that they're referencing a website that you can identify pollinators or identify the kind of bees that are in your garden.
Yes. So I think through iNaturalist, that seems to be the sort of the most popular one that that people have been using, and it's for everything. So it's not just for insects or for bees, but for all species. But you can use iNaturalist to record your observations. They have a new app which is called a Seek, and that can help identify. Sometimes, depending on the species, it can also identify those. I will say that there's a lot of interest in the research community to sort of use the data from iNaturalist to understand species distributions. So the more people that sort of contribute to that, the better. University of Illinois has the Bee Spotter app, but I'm not sure. I think it might only work within Illinois, or might be sort of supported within Illinois, but you can kind of take a look at that as well. And then through Beescape, at this point, we're collecting data from beekeepers on how their colonies have been doing. But we have sort of thoughts every now and then of sort of broadening this out to think about sort of nesting boxes for wild bees, for example, or other observations in your backyard.
Yeah, so you've talked an awful lot about what people can do in terms of their own lawn and garden, in terms of creating an environment that's conducive to pollinators. Are there things that people should stop doing on their lawns and gardens? Are there fertilizers that we should avoid? Are there just practices in general that we should avoid because they drive pollinators away?
Yes, so we really sort of strongly recommend that people follow an integrated pest management approach with managing their gardens and potential pests in their gardens. And this is something that I think is very familiar to growers, but maybe has not been sort of thought about so much for home gardeners, right? But basically, for an integrated pest management approach, you would be monitoring pests or pest damage in your gardens, and you would tolerate a certain threshold of damage, right? So not everything needs to be dealt with right away. But if you reach sort of a threshold where you feel that it's gone too far, the damage is too much, these populations are growing too much, then you can deploy a number of different strategies to control those pest populations, of which pesticides is one of those strategies, but it's really only one of sort of a whole blend of approaches that you would use. And again, this kind of requires that people maybe spend a little bit more time in their garden and think sort of more creatively about how they're gardening and what's going on in their habitats, as opposed to sort of, reaching for the easy solution, which would be sort of, hitting something with a pesticide. So I think that, again, it's kind of awareness of how these things might be impacting these pollinator species. And many of the most effective pesticides are actually also systemic, which means that you'll spray it, but it'll last for a long time and be present in the flowers for a long period of time. So again, it's important to kind of read those labels and really understand what it is that you're using, and if there's alternatives that can be more targeted, try to use those. And again, in our Pennsylvania Pollinator Protection Plan, there's a whole chapter on best practices for pesticide use that covers different things. So it's like, home gardens, mosquitoes and ticks, and so you can kind of find more tips for dealing with things in a way that is friendly to pollinators.
So you talked a little bit about this in your presentation about the range of pollinators and how far that they might spread out. But do pollinators tend to stay in the same region, or are they migratory?
So it depends on which species you're talking about. So in the case of, monarchs, they're like sort of the poster child for migratory behavior. So they're moving, they overwinter in Mexico, and then they move up during the growing season into Canada. And so they are really traveling very long distances. And so there's been, again, sort of a lot of concern about trying to make sure that they have the right habitat that they need at all stages of their journey, right? And so monarchs only lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and so having sort of abundant and available milkweed is really important for them. For some other bee species, they actually forage pretty close to home, right? And so, so some of these might forage maybe, 200 or 300 meters away from their nest. And so again, that's why it's really important to have sort of diversified flowering plants that will be kind of in an area, right, that can support these. In the case of honeybees, they can forage up to 5 kilometers away from their hive in periods of dearth and if they're looking for food. So, so they can travel really long distances if there's sort of a dearth period. And so again, that was, I think there's been a lot of interest, not just in kind of, developing your own pollinator garden in your own backyard, which can benefit those insects that can get to that, but maybe sort of developing this ethos of, pollinator habitat throughout your community so that it becomes kind of more accessible for this broader group of bees.
So you mentioned it in passing, but we have a couple questions about what is Varroa and how people can go about addressing whether they have it in their in their yards.
So
I think they're Varroa mites, right?
Varroa mites, yes. So Varroa mites are they're specifically a parasite of honeybees. And they're pretty much the worst parasite that bees have to deal with. And if Varroa populations, so the Varroa feed on the developing brood of the bees, and they transmit viruses during that time, and they also immunocompromise bees. And so there's been plenty of studies that have been done showing that if you have sort of uncontrolled Varroa mite populations, they will build over the summer, and then at the point that the bees are preparing for winter, the colony is basically too weak to make it through the winter. And so there's a number of different strategies to deal with Varroa. Again, there's a sort of an integrated pest management approach. And if you go to our bee extension website, and you go to our Center for Pollinator Research website, there's a link to the bee extension website right at the top. There is a great article that was written by Robin Underwood and Margarita Lopez Uribe on how to manage Varroa mites in your colonies and the different strategies that you can take. And again, there's sort of a range of like non-chemical methods to miticides and chemical control measures. But the most important thing is just keeping track and seeing whether or not you actually have a Varroa problem. Because mostly the issues that we've seen are beekeepers who, are not tracking these populations and they think their bees are totally fine, or they treat and they think that should be enough and they don't track those populations and then they rise again. So it's really, again, sort of having that awareness and then thinking about, again, the different strategies that you can use to keep those populations low.
Great. We are getting some questions about how people can keep up with kind of specific research projects that are going on, and I'll mention a couple. So we're getting a lot about what's going on Orchard Road, and some people are wondering, first of all, Orchard Road is here in State College. It is off Park Avenue. It is the road that goes down the hill between the Mount Nittany Medical Center and Lebrano baseball field. So basically splits the medical center and those fields from where you would, some of you might park for football games on game day. But they're also asking about kind of what specific research will be done there and at Gameland 33.
So for the solar site, this is where we're sort of developing strategies for putting pollinator habitat and pollinator forage under these solar arrays. And this is a collaboration with Ernst Conservation Seeds and with Penn State. And those plantings, I believe, are just going in right now. So we don't really have a lot, this is sort of a research study in progress in the sense that we're putting in the plant species that we think will do the best under these sorts of conditions. But we're going to have to sort of track how this changes over time. And we're actually in the process of developing some materials for, how to create pollinator meadows and how to maintain them. Which again, there's a lot of information that's kind of coming from different sources and different strategies, but we're trying to kind of consolidate that and create sort of an extension note or a fact sheet that can help people with thinking about how to create those in your own backyards. And they're not easy, because we do have a lot of invasive plant species in Pennsylvania that like to come into your plantings. And so that will be sort of one of the major issues, is how do we establish the plants that we want that are most beneficial for the pollinators, while sort of keeping the invasives to a minimum until the site becomes sort of resilient enough against those things. But what I would say is just sort of, you can check our website a lot, and we also do have a Twitter account, so any news that's posted to our website also goes to our Twitter account, and then you can at least hear about sort of the new news stories that are coming on with our center.
Absolutely, and we've just dropped that link in the chat box, so if you want to reference that link, it is there in chat. It'll also be in the follow-up email that we send to those who are participating and those who registered to participate. One final question before we wrap up here. I know we put the website there. I know you referenced Twitter. Is there a mailing list that people who are interested in your work can get on, an email list? I know some are specifically wondering about the webinar that starts on June 3rd in that series.
Yes, we don't currently have a web list, but maybe I can work with you guys to create something from this registration list. But yeah, we could maybe have a system where we can email out to the participants of this program when that webinar series becomes available, and what the specific website for that is. But it should be posted on our Center for Pollinator Research website as well.
All right, well, this has been fascinating. This has also been an exercise in me resisting all the bee puns that I could possibly come up with. So Christina, you have to have your favorite bee pun. So what would, can you even believe I'm asking this question?
Very nice. I've heard a lot of bee puns, and we have a lot of bee paraphernalia that we get. So I will not claim to have a favorite, but I encourage all of you to think about bee puns for the rest of the day.
That is great. Well, there's a lot of buzz about the work that you're doing over there, and we're truly grateful that it's happening at Penn State. So that's all for today. Yeah, thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Dr. Grozinger for joining us, and I also want to thank all of you who tuned in to today's virtual speaker series. As a reminder, we'll be hosting additional speaker sessions in the coming weeks and months, and this program is in addition to the wide array of career and networking focused programs that we also offer. To stay up to date on what's going on at the Penn State Alumni Association, visit our website at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thanks for joining us again, and we are excellent.